On a sweltering January morning in 1593, two childhood friends prepared to face each other in mortal combat, mounted atop the most fearsome war machines of their age. The thunderous trumpeting of elephants echoed across the fields near Suphanburi as two armies watched their leaders charge toward destiny. This was not merely a battle for territory or tribute. This was the moment that would decide whether Siam would remain a vassal state forever or rise as an independent kingdom. The story of King Naresuan and his legendary elephant duel with Crown Prince Mingyi Swa has become the defining myth of Thai heroism, celebrated every year as Armed Forces Day. Yet beneath the legend lies a far of friendship, more complex tale, betrayal, and the brutal realities of Southeast Asian warfare. To understand how two former friends came to meet in such deadly circumstances, we must journey back to the turbulent world of 16th century Southeast Asia. This was an era when kingdoms rose and fell with the swing of a sword, when war elephants charged through gunpowder smoke, and when a single moment of courage or cowardice could reshape the destiny of nations. The stage for this epic confrontation was set decades earlier, when the mighty Toungoo dynasty of Burma cast its shadow across the region. Under the brilliant military leadership of King Bayin, Burmese armies had swept through mainland Southeast Asia like a monsoon tide, conquering kingdoms and reducing proud rulers to trembling vassals. By 1569, even the great kingdom of Ayutthaya, the jewel of Siam, had fallen to Burmese might. The conquest was devastating. Ayutthaya's walls, which had stood unconquered for centuries, crumbled before Burmese cannons. The city's golden spires, symbols of Siamese power and independence, were stripped of their treasures. Thousands of Siamese nobles and artisans were marched away as captives, their skills to serve their new Burmese masters. The kingdom that had once commanded respect from China to India was reduced to a mere province of the expanding Toungoo Empire, but conquest was only the beginning of Bayinong's strategy. The Burmese king understood that ruling distant territories required more than military force. He needed to ensure the loyalty of the conquered through bonds deeper than fear. His solution was as clever as it was cruel. He demanded hostages from the royal families of his vassal states, young princes who would be raised in the Burmese court, educated in Burmese ways, and molded into loyal servants of the empire. Among these hostages was a young Siamese prince named Naresuan, son of King Mahathamaraja Thirat. The puppet ruler Bayinong had installed on the throne of Ayutthaya. At just 9 years old, Naresuan was torn from his homeland and brought to the glittering capital of Pegu, where he would spend the next 15 years of his life as both honored guest and captive. The Burmese court was a place of incredible sophistication and deadly intrigue. Portuguese merchants and mercenaries mingled with Buddhist monks and court astrologers. The palace halls echoed with a dozen languages as tribute bearers arrived from kingdoms across Southeast Asia. At the center of it all sat Bayinong, the king who had built the largest empire in Southeast Asian history, a ruler whose word could raise armies or level cities. For young Naresuan, this foreign court became his world. He learned to speak Burmese as fluently as Siamese. He studied the classics of Buddhist literature alongside the latest European military treatises. He watched Portuguese instructors demonstrate the loading and firing of matchlock muskets. He observed the training of war elephants, those massive beasts that formed the backbone of Southeast Asian armies. Most importantly, he formed friendships with other royal hostages, young men like himself who had been separated from their families to serve as living guarantees of their father's loyalty. Among these companions was Mingyi Swa, grandson of the great Bayinong himself. The two boys, despite their different backgrounds, became close friends. They trained together in the arts of war, competed in mock battles, and shared the unique bond of those who understood the weight of royal expectations. Under the tutelage of Portuguese military advisors, both young men mastered the complex art of elephant warfare. They learned to read the moods and movements of these temperamental giants, to direct them with subtle pressure from knee and heel, to fight from their swaying backs with lance and sword. The elephant was more than a mount in Southeast Asian warfare. It was a symbol of royal power, a mobile fortress, and a psychological weapon all in one. The military traditions they and sophisticate absorbed were ancient. War elephants had thundered across Asian battlefields for over a millennium, from the campaigns of Alexander the Great to the epic struggles recorded in Indian literature. In Southeast Asia, these traditions had evolved into something uniquely refined. Elephants were not merely beasts of war, but partners in an intricate dance of combat that required years of training to master. A typical war elephant carried not just its royal rider, but an entire crew. The mahout, or elephant driver, sat on the beast's neck, guiding it with voice commands and the pressure of an iron hook called an ankus. Behind him, on a wooden platform called a howdah, rode the prince or general, armed with a long-handled weapon called a ngao, part spear and part sword, for combat designed specifically from elephant back. A signaller completed the crew, waving peacock feathers to communicate with other units across the chaos of battle. But elephants were more than military assets. They were deeply woven into the religious and cultural fabric of Southeast Asian societies. White elephants, rare albino specimens, were considered sacred, their possession a mark of divine favor upon the ruler who owned them. The capture and training of war elephants required enormous resources and specialized knowledge, making them symbols of royal wealth and power. As Naresuan and Mingyi Swa came of age in the Burmese court, they witnessed the empire at its zenith. Tribute flowed in from dozens of vassal states. Trade routes carried goods from China to India through Burmese-controlled territories. The royal elephants numbered in the thousands, their trumpeting calls echoing from enormous training grounds outside the capital. Yet beneath this impressive facade, cracks were beginning to show. The empire Bayin Nong had built through conquest was held together largely by his personal charisma and military genius. When he died in 1581, the succession passed to his son, Nanda Bayin, a ruler who possessed neither his father's strategic brilliance nor his ability to inspire loyalty among distant vassals. For Naresuan, now 25 years old and thoroughly educated in the ways of war and statecraft, his captor's death represented opportunity. He had spent 16 years observing Burmese strengths and weaknesses, learning their military tactics, studying their political divisions. More importantly, he had never forgotten that he was Siamese, that his true loyalty lay with the kingdom of his birth. When Naresuan was finally allowed to return to Ayutthaya as heir apparent, the Burmese believed they had created the perfect vassal prince. He spoke their language, understood their customs, and had been raised alongside their own nobility. They expected him to rule Siam as a faithful puppet, collecting tribute and maintaining order on behalf of his Burmese overlords. They could not have been more wrong. The young man who returned to Ayutthaya carried within him both the knowledge to defeat the Burmese and the burning desire to restore his kingdom's independence. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through the centuries, a battle between former friends that would determine the fate of Southeast Asia. The return of Naresuan to Ayutthaya in 1584 was met with celebration, but also with uncertainty. The people who lined the streets to welcome their prince home saw a man transformed by his years of captivity. Gone was the boy who had been taken from them 16 years earlier. In his place stood a seasoned warrior who carried himself with the confidence of someone who had learned the secrets of their enemies. The kingdom Naresuan inherited was a shadow of its former glory. The great city of Ayutthaya, once the pride of Southeast Asia, bore the scars of conquest. Many of its finest temples had been stripped of their gold and precious stones. The royal library, containing centuries of Siamese literature and historical records, had been reduced to ashes. Entire districts lay empty, their populations driven away by war or carried off as slaves to Burma. Yet the spirit of the Siamese people had not been broken. In villages throughout the kingdom, old men still spoke of the days when Ayutthaya's armies had marched as conquerors rather than servants. Buddhist monks preserved ancient texts that spoke of righteous kings who had defended their people against foreign tyranny. The memory of independence lived on in whispered conversations and carefully guarded hopes. Naresuan understood that his people yearned for freedom, but he also knew the terrible cost of premature rebellion. The Burmese Empire remained a colossus, its armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Any open defiance would bring swift and brutal retaliation. Instead, he began to prepare methodically, quietly building the foundations of resistance while maintaining the appearance of loyal service. The prince began by reforming Siam's military structure. Using the knowledge he had gained during his captivity, he introduced new training methods and weapons. Portuguese mercenaries were secretly recruited to instruct Siamese soldiers in the use of firearms. Elephant Corps were reorganized and expanded. Most importantly, he began to cultivate a new generation of military leaders who shared his vision of independence. While Naresuan plotted rebellion, his former friend Mingyi Swa was rising through the ranks of the Burmese military hierarchy. As grandson of the great Bayin, he carried the weight of enormous expectations. The empire his grandfather had built was beginning to fragment, with rebellions breaking out in distant provinces and vassal states testing the limits of Burmese authority. Mingyi Swa had grown into a formidable warrior and strategist in his own right. Like Naresuan, he had absorbed the military lessons of their shared youth, mastering the intricate art of elephant warfare and the newer science of gunpowder tactics. But where Naresuan dreamed of independence, Mingyi Swa remained committed to preserving his grandfather's empire, to proving himself worthy of the Toungoo legacy. The break came in 1584 when Naresuan made his fateful decision. Standing before the sacred pillar that marked the boundary between Siam and Burma, he declared his kingdom's independence with words that would echo through Thai history. The symbolic cutting of the rope that bound Siam to Burma was more than a political gesture. It was a declaration of war against the most powerful empire in Southeast Asia. The Burmese response was swift and devastating. King Nanda Bayin, determined to crush this rebellion before it could inspire others, assembled a massive invasion force. At its head rode Mingyi Swa, the Crown Prince who had once shared childhood games with the rebel king. The boy who had been Naresuan's closest friend was now tasked with bringing him back in chains or delivering his head to the Burmese court. What followed was a decade of brutal warfare that ravaged the countryside and tested the resolve of both kingdoms. The Burmese launched invasion after invasion, each met by increasingly sophisticated Siamese resistance. Naresuan proved to be a master of defensive warfare, using his kingdom's rivers and forests to blunt the impact of superior Burmese numbers. The conflict transformed both men. Naresuan evolved from a rebellious prince into a seasoned king, his strategic brilliance evident in victory after victory against overwhelming odds. His ability to inspire fierce loyalty among his subjects became legendary, as ordinary farmers and merchants took up arms to defend their homeland. Mingyi Swa, meanwhile, found himself trapped between duty and mounting frustration. Campaign after campaign ended in failure, as the Siamese proved far more resilient than anyone had expected. The Crown Prince, who had been raised to command vast armies, found himself outmaneuvered time and again by his former friend, his reputation suffering with each unsuccessful invasion. By 1593, both kingdoms were exhausted by the prolonged conflict. The Burmese Empire, once seemingly invincible, was facing rebellions on multiple fronts. Resources that might have been used for trade and development were instead poured into endless military campaigns. The Siamese, while successful in their resistance, had paid a terrible price in blood and treasure. It was against this backdrop of mutual exhaustion that the final confrontation took shape. King Nanda Bayin, desperate to end the Siamese rebellion once and for all, assembled what he intended to be the largest and most powerful invasion force ever sent against Ayutthaya. At its head, he placed his most trusted general, the Crown Prince who carried the hopes of the dynasty. Mingyi Swa understood that this campaign would determine his fate and that of the empire. Success would restore Burmese prestige and secure his position as heir to the throne. Failure would likely mean the end of Burmese dominance in Southeast Asia and possibly his own death. The stakes could not have been higher. For Naresuan, the approaching invasion represented both the greatest threat his kingdom had ever faced and perhaps its greatest opportunity. If he could defeat this final Burmese assault, Siam's independence would be secure. If he failed, his people would face enslavement or annihilation. As the two armies converged on the fields near Suphanburi, both commanders knew they were approaching a moment of destiny. The boy who had dreamed of restoring his kingdom's glory was about to face the friend who had been tasked with destroying those dreams. The outcome would determine not just the fate of two kingdoms, but the course of Southeast Asian history for centuries to come. The morning of January 18th, 1593, dawned grey and humid over the Nong Sarai plains. Mist clung to the rice paddies and waterways that crisscrossed the battlefield, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that seemed fitting for what was to come. The air hung heavy with tension as two massive armies prepared for what both sides knew would be the decisive engagement of a conflict that had raged for nearly a decade. The Burmese force that had assembled was truly spectacular in its size and organization. Contemporary accounts describe an army that stretched beyond the horizon, its banners and standards creating a forest of silk and gold that rippled in the morning breeze. At its core marched the famous Burmese infantry, disciplined formations of men armed with both traditional weapons and the newer Portuguese muskets that had revolutionized warfare throughout the region. But it was the elephant corps that truly commanded attention. Hundreds of these magnificent beasts, each carrying its crew of warriors, formed the backbone of the Burmese assault force. Their trumpeting calls echoed across the plains like thunder, a sound that had struck fear into the hearts of enemies across Southeast Asia for generations. At the head of this mighty host rode Mingyi Swa himself, mounted on his war elephant, his armor glinting in the pale morning light. The Siamese army, though vastly outnumbered, presented its own formidable appearance. Years of constant warfare had forged these men into veterans who knew their survival depended on discipline and courage. They had learned to fight against overwhelming odds, to use their knowledge of the terrain and their fierce determination to compensate for inferior numbers. King Naresuan positioned his forces with the strategic brilliance that had made him legendary throughout the region. He understood that a conventional battle would likely result in Siamese defeat, given the disparity in numbers. Instead, he chose his ground carefully, using the natural features of the landscape to channel the Burmese advance and minimize their numerical advantage. The battle began at dawn, with a thunderous exchange of artillery fire. Portuguese cannons, operated by European mercenaries serving both sides, hurled iron balls across the misty fields. The roar of gunpowder weapons mixed with the screams of wounded men and elephants, creating a cacophony that could be heard for miles around. As the morning progressed, the fighting intensified. Burmese infantry advanced in waves, their disciplined ranks pressing forward despite heavy casualties. The Siamese defenders gave ground slowly, falling back from position to position while maintaining their cohesion. This was not the chaotic melee of earlier centuries, but a sophisticated form of warfare that combined ancient Asian military traditions with the latest European innovations. The elephant units on both sides moved like mobile fortresses across the battlefield. These massive beasts, trained for years in the arts of war, crashed through infantry formations and engaged each other in contests of strength and skill. The sight of elephants grappling with their trunks while their riders fought with lance and sword was both magnificent and terrifying. Throughout the morning, both Naresuan and Mingyi Swa remained in constant motion, directing their forces and inspiring their men through personal example. The two former friends could see each other across the chaos of battle, each recognizing in the other the skills they had learned together as boys in the Burmese court. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became oppressive. Men fought in temperatures that soared above 100 degrees, their armor becoming furnaces that sapped strength and endurance. The elephants, too, began to show signs of distress, their massive bodies overheating in the tropical Sunday. It was during this crucial phase of the battle that the event occurred which would transform military engagement into legend. The exact details remain disputed by historians, with different sources providing conflicting accounts of what actually transpired. What is certain is that both armies suddenly found their attention focused on a dramatic confrontation between their two leaders. According to the most romantic version of events, King Naresuan found himself isolated from his main force when his war elephant, driven into a frenzy by the heat and noise of battle, charged deep into the Burmese lines. Whether by accident or design, the Siamese king suddenly found himself surrounded by enemy forces, his own troops unable to follow him into the press of Burmese spears and muskets. In this moment of supreme danger, Naresuan supposedly caught sight of Mingyi Swa, positioned beneath a large tree, his elephant seeking shade from the brutal Sunday. The challenge that followed would become one of the most famous speeches in Thai history, a declaration that encapsulated all the honor and tragedy of their situation. The words attributed to Naresuan ring with the formal courtesy of royal address, mixed with the bitter understanding of former friendship, turned to enmity. Here were two men who had shared their youth, who understood each other's strengths and weaknesses, who had been shaped by the same teachers and the same experiences, now facing each other as mortal enemies. The response from Mingyi Swa, though less well documented in Thai sources, must have been equally poignant. Here was the grandson of the great Bayin Nong, heir to the most powerful throne in Southeast Asia, being challenged to single combat by the rebel he had been sent to capture. Honor demanded that he accept, even though prudence might have suggested otherwise. What followed was a spectacle that transcended mere warfare. As the two elephants approached each other, the fighting around them began to slow and then stop altogether. Soldiers on both sides, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary, lowered their weapons and watched in fascination as their leaders prepared to settle the fate of kingdoms through personal combat. The elephants themselves seemed to understand the solemnity of the moment. These intelligent beasts, trained for years in the rituals of war, approached each other with the measured pace of gladiators entering the arena. The mahouts who guided them were among the most skilled in all of Southeast Asia. Men who had devoted their lives to understanding the complex partnership between human and elephant in battle. The weapons carried by both combatants were specifically designed for elephant-back warfare. The ngao, a long-handled blade that combined the reach of a spear with the cutting power of a sword, required enormous skill to wield effectively from the swaying platform of an elephant's back. Years of training were needed to master the balance and timing necessary to strike effectively while maintaining one's seat. The duel began with the formal courtesy demanded by royal combat. Both men acknowledged each other with the traditional gestures of respect, even as they prepared to fight to the death. This was not mere bloodlust, but a ritualized encounter that carried deep cultural and political significance for everyone who witnessed it. The clash of weapons rang across the suddenly quiet battlefield as the two now met in a shower of sparks. Both combatants demonstrated the skills that had made them legendary throughout the region, their blades flashing in complex patterns as they sought advantage over their opponent. The elephants, responding to the subtle commands of their riders, maneuvered for position while their human cargo fought above them. The heat of the day added another dimension to the combat. Both men were encased in armor that, while providing protection, also trapped body heat and made every movement an effort of will. Sweat poured down their faces, blurring their vision and making their grip on their weapons uncertain, yet neither showed any sign of yielding. The crowd of warriors surrounding them held their breath as the combat reached its climax. According to legend, Mingyi Swa managed to land the first telling blow, his ngao slicing through the air with deadly precision. The blade caught the edge of Naresuan's helmet, shearing away a piece of the ornate metalwork and drawing gasps from the watching Siamese soldiers. For a moment, it seemed as though the Burmese prince might achieve victory, his superior reach and positioning giving him the advantage he needed. But Naresuan was not called the Great without reason. The Siamese king, his vision momentarily obscured by sweat and the ringing blow to his head, steadied himself on his elephant's back and prepared his counterattack. What happened next would be debated by historians for centuries, but the outcome was undeniable. With a movement that combined years of training with desperate necessity, Naresuan struck back. His ngao descended in a terrible arc, finding its mark with devastating effect. The blade caught Mingyi Swa across the shoulder and chest, cutting deep into the Burmese prince's body. The Crown Prince of the Toungoo Empire, heir to the greatest throne in Southeast Asia, toppled from his elephant and crashed to the earth below. The silence that followed was profound. For a heartbeat, neither army seemed able to process what they had witnessed. Then, like a dam bursting, the implications of the moment crashed over both forces. The Burmese troops, seeing their beloved prince fall, began to waver. Confusion spread through their ranks as word of Mingyi Swa's death rippled across the battlefield. Yet even this dramatic account, beloved by generations of Thai schoolchildren and immortalized in countless works of art, may not reflect the full truth of what occurred that January morning. European observers, whose accounts might be expected to provide more objective testimony, paint a very different picture of the prince's final moments. According to these sources, the chaos of battle was far more decisive than any formal duel. A Burmese war elephant, driven mad by the heat and noise of combat, had charged into its own lines, creating havoc among the Burmese forces. In the confusion that followed, Mingyi Swa's elephant was pushed into the open, exposing the prince to enemy fire. The thunder of battle faded into legend that January day in 1593, but the echoes of that moment continue to resonate through Thai hearts over 4 centuries later. Whether the death of Mingyi Swa came through noble duel or battlefield chaos matters less than what it represented. A kingdom's refusal to bow, a people's determination to stand free, and the price of independence paid in blood and sacrifice. Naresuan had achieved what seemed impossible, transforming Siam from vassal to victor, from captive to conqueror. The boy who had been taken as a hostage returned as a liberator. The friend who had become an enemy died so that a nation might live. Today, as Thai soldiers march past his statue each Armed Forces Day, they honor not just a king, but the moment when courage conquered empire and freedom was born from friendship's ashes.